This is Defender Radio.
I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers, brought to you by the Fur Bearers. Room to roam for wildlife is essential to their health, particularly as they face increasing pressures related to development and the climate crisis. But many communities aren't planned with wildlife in mind, or ecological connectivity between neighborhoods and boundaries. The California State Assembly, however, has passed the Room to Roam Act, which compels local governments to work with each other and state agencies to ensure resilient, sustainable ecosystems are connected to protect wildlife, the environment, and human health. To share more about this exciting legislation, the impact it may have, and why connectivity is an essential tool for climate adaptation and resilience, is Dr. Tiffany Yap, Senior Scientist at the Center for Biological Diversity. Can we share a bit about the Center for Biological Diversity? It's an impressive organization with a pretty huge impact overall. Could you just kind of give us the quick rundown on the organization?
The Center for Biological Diversity is an environmental nonprofit. It's been around for a few decades now, and really we work to protect sensitive animals and plants and habitats using the power of science and the law, environmental laws and policies, and also media. So that's like social media, but also, op-eds and letters to the editor and things like that, and speaking to reporters. And so we really have this multi-pronged approach for conservation. And I work in the Urban Wildlands program. And so a lot of what we focus on is land use planning and policy and environmental laws that pertain to land use. And so we often look at how developments are being proposed and, where they're being proposed, how they're affecting the environment, how they're affecting sensitive and special status species. Kind of, as I said, using the science that's out there, the best available science, and the laws that are out there that are the tools for us to implement and enforce conservation.
And I find the urban wildlands topic personally fascinating. It's something I'm very interested in, and I think is very much the future of environmental protection. While we do need to be working on these massive swatches of conserved land, the reality is most of us live in urban areas. Most animals are getting used to urban areas. We got to figure that out. And a big issue there is the subject of connectivity. So before we get into the legislation and everything, I came across your California Connections report. I think it was 2021, 3 years ago, which, again, anyone interested in this, it's 18 pages, well organized. It really does a great job of summarizing the different issues related to connectivity. So we'll have links to that in the show notes, and I encourage people to check it out. But for now, could you explain what connectivity is in ecosystems and why it matters, just very high level as a principle?
Yeah, sure. So the way I think of wildlife connectivity, it's just permeability on the landscape. It's room to roam for animals. It's to find the food, the things they need, the resources they need. So that's food and water and shelter, and then unrelated mates. And so a lot of times when people think of wildlife connectivity, oftentimes wildlife corridors come into mind, which are a part of connectivity, but it's not the whole picture, because when we talk about corridors, often it's just like one pathway. And we think like, oh, this is like animals need this one pathway to do the things they do, whether it's seasonally or not. When really most animals don't work that way. It's not a single pathway. It's often just meandering on the landscape and finding the suitable habitat they need. And their behaviors and their fears of things kind of drive where they go and how they move about the landscape. And so having these open spaces that are connected are really important for them so that they can meander and find the things they need, because they may not find that one corridor, that one pathway that we think that they would use. It's really just open space, right? And there's multiple kinds of connectivity. We can have what I'm describing right now, which is just like open, huge patches of habitat that are just open and they can just meander wherever. but there's also linear connectivity. So some that's kind of like the corridors, and that could be natural corridors. So like streams and rivers are often in riparian areas. Those are areas where a lot of animals like to move through and follow. There's lots of great resources there. And it might connect larger areas of bigger habitat patches. But sometimes there's like patchy habitat connectivity where it might be like, if we think about like the large scale, like continental habitat patchy connectivity, it's for migratory birds, right? So they're going to be flying thousands of miles along the West Coast, let's say, we're like the Pacific Flyway, and they're going to need areas to rest. They're going to need areas to like recuperate, to find shelter and refuge, to find food along the way, or eventually their stopping point. But we need to make sure they have those habitats to stop at so that they can survive their journey, right? But sometimes it could even be like our backyards could be patchy habitat for like pollinators. If we have native plants in our yards, a lot of like local native bees and butterflies and birds can really utilize that habitat, and it helps them as they are moving around us get the things that they need.
It's a great explanation, and I think it's ways that are really fascinating to see this in life. If you're in an urban center, and Toronto is a great example of this, I'm sure, you spend time looking up at the wiring across the roads, power lines, transit lines, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And you'll start to see squirrels, raccoons, all kinds of different birds using them because it effectively works the same as long tree branches or weird rises in the land. It's just, this is how we get from point A to point B. But many species that we're forcing to adapt, and I say that intentionally, we're forcing to adapt to urban life, don't have that ability to just, climb a pole and run across something. And that's, I think, when we end up hearing a lot of people talk about, well, why are we seeing more of this animal or more of that animal? And it's that concept of, well, we're not seeing more of them. We're just not giving them space to get from point A to point B sometimes. So, yeah, maybe there's this beautiful park and ravine system that foxes like to live in. And then there's another one 5 kilometers to the east. Well, if we don't connect those in any way ecologically, we force them into these other areas.
Yeah.
I always find that very interesting to sort of see. And that's something that has continued to become a problem as urban development grows. We're facing a housing crisis in Canada and seeing an exceptional uptick in building of urban areas, more densification, all of these things which are necessary. But very much the point of this legislation we're talking about and the report you put together is we need to think about these things before we build them rather than afterward. So what are ways that, right now we can see examples of this maybe? That can help people picture the connectivity that we're talking about before we get into the policy.
Sure. Well, let's see. To your point about we need to think about this before in the design phase, as we plan it out and before we build it. I think we know that now because we've done so much of not thinking about it before doing it. And we have the consequences of that, right? So a lot of the roads and development that we've designed and built has really harmed a lot of the wildlife around us. And because people just weren't thinking about it. We didn't know how important movement for the species were, that they couldn't move around us all the time. We just weren't thinking about them. And we know so much more about species now, different individual species, that it really helps to fill the picture a little bit better for us. And so I think one thing that has come up, it's been around for a while, especially in Canada, but the US has been a little bit slower on the uptake, and that is wildlife crossings over roads. I think they could be over roads or under roads, but that is something that is gaining momentum, at least in California, and I think in the US, and I don't know if it has been a constant thing for folks in Canada, but that's been something that I think really should, because as time has passed, there have been some crossings that have been built, and we can see what's effective and what's not. And so,
Yep.
you know, they're the ones up in Banff, but then there's also, I think, more, and those have been around for a while. And then there are more recent ones in Colorado and in
Hmm.
Arizona that people are like really monitoring and studying and reporting about. And so that's been really helpful for us to figure out, okay, what works for some species and not other species? Where are good places to put them? How do we define, how do we figure out what place, where to put them? And I think once we got some of that information and are starting to implement it, we're seeing how effective they can be, not only for facilitating
Yep.
wildlife movement and getting animals safely across the road, but also making the road safer for people because drivers aren't hitting as many wildlife. There are less wildlife vehicle collisions in places where we have these wildlife crossings. And so I think that is a really great example. Like those are a really great example of how we can like retrofit our existing infrastructure.
Hmm.
And then I think moving forward, um, we need to continue doing that. We need a lot of retrofitting on our roads, but it's not just roads that are affecting connectivity because there's all these other edge effects from all the development. Well, there's the habitat loss from our development, but then there's also all these edge effects from the noise we make, from the lights we use,
Hmm.
from, you know, if people are putting rodenticides on the landscapes or other pesticides and herbicides on the landscape, that can really affect a lot of different species. There are lots of different things. Even like the way our buildings are, the way the structures are built and look can be really impactful to species. So like a good example of that is with migratory birds. You know, there's a lot of
Yes.
window strikes if the buildings reflect the trees next to them, or that, you know, it's
Hmm.
really, glass isn't something that wildlife has evolved with, and so you know, it can be really
Yep.
harmful for them if it's not designed properly. But there are ways to minimize those harms by just thinking a little bit about it and being more careful where we put things and how they look and how they're designed.
Yeah, and that's one. I mean, I've put up the bird safe window stickers for I think it was like $9.95 at the garden center. You buy the semi-translucent stickers; they go on 4 inches apart or 4 centimeters apart, and all of a sudden, birds aren't going to try and fly through
Yeah.
that glass, and you stop noticing after a couple of days. Like the solutions are there
Hmm.
for us. It's a matter of education, and then I think, as noted through all of this, creating policy. Because we again, you've pointed out the great evidence around highway underpasses and overpasses here in Canada. I got to interview some folks from Parks Canada a few years ago about that,
Oh, cool.
which was a lot of fun, and how successful they are. Um, but it also then has those spin-off impacts of the reduced vehicle strikes means reduced insurance claims, means reduced highway maintenance, and all of these ancillary
Yeah.
costs we don't think about because we don't need to think about them on a day-to-day basis. But it can add up to a lot of money over time, and investing ahead of it seems to make a difference. The one that I'm seeing in Ontario is the deer crossing one. So it's not a true crossing, but it's a way of setting up berms along the side of the highway and really tall fences. So it's if a deer gets across, they're shuffled effectively back into one area with the rays on
Yeah.
the highway side so they can get over it, but they can't get back. Little things like that are going to make a
Hmm.
big difference over time. And
Yeah.
for those people in Ontario who may agree, rather than building brand new highways no one wants or needs, we could use that money and infrastructure time to retrofit a lot of stuff. But that's a whole different conversation. Um, so let's talk then about this policy because it's exciting to see legislation come into effect, especially at the state level. This is something personally I see a lot in local government policy, where specific counselors or staff members have been very passionate and well informed about it and are introducing things. Like we are doing a lot, but
Yeah.
when it hits that state level, I think it's very beneficial. So we're talking about the Room to Roam Act.
Mhm.
How long do you think that's been in the works for? I mean, you've clearly been working on this subject matter for a while.
Yeah.
What was the process to get this to the legislature and then through the whole
Yeah.
process?
Well, yeah, you know, I think it's something that developed kind of organically as we were doing the work that we've been doing. And so There's been lots of different influences in terms of like, as we work to protect, to message about the importance of wildlife connectivity and protect wildlife connectivity, not only for these animals being able to move, but also for climate resilience, because as climate change intensifies and resources on the landscape shift, like the wildlife need to be able to move about too, and that's better for us as well. There are two things that come to mind that kind of preempt this bill. And so one is a previous bill called the Safe Roads and Wildlife Protection Act, and that was passed in 2022. But that's something that we worked on for quite a few years to kind of finally get it passed in 2022 in California, and it was in California. And so the bill number, it's AB 2344. And that bill requires the California Department of Transportation and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to coordinate with each other to get more wildlife crossings on state highways, on state roads. And so if they're building a new road, which hopefully they're not, because as you said, we don't need more roads, we need better ways to transport. So if they build a new road, or if they're doing maintenance on an existing road, then they need to consider wildlife connectivity and put wildlife crossings there if they need to. And that could even be something as simple as upgrading a culvert that already exists there. And then they have to do, identifying priority areas for where wildlife crossings are needed and things like that. And so that was like kind of the bill that really kicked it off at the state level for us. We wanted to, and the thing about wildlife crossings is they can be really effective, but there's all these other things that you have to consider when you're building a wildlife crossing, where they're being located, what's the sound like, what's the lighting going to be like, is there protected habitat on both sides of the crossings? Because if not, wildlife animals might be able to use it until the area that's not protected gets developed. And then what? It renders that wildlife crossing less functional. Right. And so that was something that's constantly on our minds. Right. And so with the passage of the Safe Roads and Wildlife Protection Act, we were like, well, how do we ensure that the actions and the investment that goes into enforcing that bill pays off in the long term and remains effective? That's where the Room to Roam Act came up, which is AB 1889, also in California. So the California Department of Transportation and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, they're the state agencies that have to deal with the Safe Roads and Wildlife Protection Act. But with the Room to Roam Act, what it does is it applies statewide, but it focuses on cities and counties and their planning process. And basically, when they have to do their general plans to identify, like when they do either have general plans already, so they often have to do updates every so often, or if they're like become a new city, then they have to make a general plan. So the Room to Roam Act requires, when those updates or creations of the general plans are happening, that wildlife connectivity needs to be considered, which it's not right now. There are open space elements and conservation elements, but there's nothing specific to wildlife connectivity. And that, we think, is a really important thing that needs to be looked at in a comprehensive way, because not just, like cities and counties, most of them are not just isolated little islands, right? They're connected to each other. So there's regional connectivity is really important. And so really taking into account more holistically what is going on in their area, but also around them, and how we can either mostly protect the remaining existing connectivity, is important in planning where we want to build any new development, right? Because if we're thinking the long game, that can play a really important part in how developers look at the situation and really figure out, okay, where can I build and how should I be building? And it allows for coordination with the California Department of Transportation and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, where new crossings are going to be either built or are already built or planned to be built, because then we'll be able to identify areas where crossings already exist, where we've put so much investment, and we won't destroy those crossings and ruin the function of that.
It's a very it sounds overwhelming, and it is in some ways. But I think when you sort of apply a little bit of information about what we know about urban planning now, right? So talking about developers building out development, well, they're already looking at how are they going to fit homes in there, how are they fitting infrastructure in there, and how are they
Right.
managing people circulation, which is always a process in the design of any space. And I think the legislation, it does outline like, all right, these are the 5 places more or less where you need to be looking at this stuff, and
Mhm.
here's how you need to
Mhm.
communicate with these different departments. And I guess it's very much just challenging in now add wildlife circulation to the process. Like
Mhm.
it's not
Yeah,
impossible. We have the tools to do it. They're very accessible tools for those who have the training.
exactly.
It's just a matter of making it one of the priorities, which is a very
Mhm.
exciting thing. And I think that builds into as well. And I'd like to get a bit into climate resiliency and adaptation. So we're talking about wildlife and the need for wildlife to move around and be able to shift as extreme weather comes and changes to the environment happen. But it's also going to
Mhm.
help people and our places in general.
Mhm.
Could you share a bit about how what we do for wildlife in resiliency for climate ends up benefiting us?
Yeah, absolutely. I still haven't figured out like the best term for this, so I'm just going to use the term that I know because I haven't come up with my own yet. Ecosystem services
Hmm.
are like, gosh, critical for our
Yep.
livelihoods. We benefit so much, but it's very difficult we benefit so much from healthy ecosystems, from healthy habitats and healthy wildlife. It's hard to quantify, it's hard to pinpoint all the things, but healthy ecosystems give us cleaner air,
Hmm.
cleaner water, healthy pollinators that not only pollinate what's in like parks and places we think of as nature, but they also help keep pollinators that pollinate our food, our crops.
Yep.
Bats are so important to keep. They're not pollinating here. They're more keeping pests away. But um, birds, bees, butterflies, like they are pollinating. They help pollinate a lot of the food that we eat. And so, the healthy ecosystems also keep us safe from like extreme weather. They help buffer extreme storms, things like that. And so they also store a lot of carbon.
Hmm.
We think of um, trees as being really big carbon sequestration entities, but they're not the only ones. Grasslands, shrublands, even deserts store carbon too. And so that in itself is a nature-based solution that helps us combat the climate crisis. So there are all these ways that these ecosystems are benefiting people. Also, people like recreation.
Yep.
People go out for mental health, to just get some fresh air. It's also really important culturally for a lot of people, and so I think there's so much value to a healthy ecosystem, and it really benefits us
Yeah.
to keep them healthy, to prioritize that and to put the effort in, put the investment in, put the like critical thinking in, to find ways to make sure we keep what's still existing and is healthy, but also restore what we've degraded so much and also try to keep as much connected as possible because that will, in the long run, be much easier for us and much better for us if we do that now, as opposed to finding out much later that, oh, if only we had conserved it, because it's so much hard. Like restoration is possible,
Hmm.
but it's so much harder and so much more investment is needed to make that happen.
Yeah. Oh, that's one that's completely shocked me was learning about I did a class on naturalization, which was amazing from a landscape horticulture point of view, and talking about, oh, you've got a great site you want to naturalize. It's an old factory, torn down, it's just asphalt. It's like, all right, so you got to get rid of that asphalt, dig down 6 to 8 feet, and completely rebuild the
Yeah.
soil, which takes months and thousands of dollars at a
Mhm.
minimum. Um, and that it's a lot, it's doable, like you said, but it's a lot more work than saying, hey, you see this area we've kind of ignored
Mhm.
over here, let's add some vegetation that will help soil
Yeah.
erosion, and let's allow the beavers to build their ponds, and let's allow nature to be
Mhm.
nature. It makes a big
Yeah.
difference. Now I'm curious, what people want to be involved in these kinds of projects. They want to see this kind of change, and I think anyone in the areas where the Center for Biological Diversity is working, I encourage to check out your website, biologicaldiversity.org. Get involved as a supporter. But here in Southern Ontario or in remote BC or different parts of Europe, how can we as individuals on our own homes and properties help with connectivity? What are things that we can be implementing individually that can help these broader projects?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think one great way is to just be curious of like
Mhm.
your surroundings. Like who's around you? Oftentimes, especially in kind of more urban areas, people think, well, there's no wildlife around anyway.
Yeah.
But like you said, if you look up, you start seeing stuff. I live in San Francisco, and I was at a friend's place last night, and we were on the roof, and we were like in the middle. It was like downtown San Francisco, highly, highly urban. And we were just looking at the amazing views, and a peregrine falcon flew right in front of us, and then it hung out for a little bit and then it dove. And we were like, oh my gosh, what did it like? Did it get something? And it was just like, you don't always expect it, but they're around us,
Yep.
and if you're lucky enough to be near green space, there's just it's like booming with life. It just takes a little bit of paying attention to it, and being curious to see what's out there. And I think that kind of curiosity will lead to like feeling connected to what's around you. And then, I think depending on the things you have, like I think if you have a yard and you're curious, kind of like what you did, I think that would be really fun, to get some native plants out there and
Mhm.
see how the landscape changes or see what, comes to visit. So lighting can be a problem for a lot of
Yeah.
species. And so, having, I forget what they are, but the lower light bulb voltage,
Oh, like
wattage,
the market
uh,
lights.
maybe, sure, yes,
Yeah.
let's go with that. But
Let's
just
call it
like,
low voltage lighting.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. That, yeah. And or, make sure it really faces down.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes what happens with, if the lights are just, like city glow, and like really tall buildings that have lots of lights can confuse migrating birds and migrating bats to the point where, they just exhaust themselves because they get so disoriented in the light. And so if we have light that just points down and is very direct for where it's needed, that can be really, really helpful. Making sure windows are more wildlife friendly and bird friendly so that, birds are snacking into them is really great. I mean, this is something that I think is really cool that has come up for some of the work that I've been doing in California. And I've really seen communities kind of come together, like they see an issue and they come together and they want to solve it.
Mhm.
They want to help the animals around them. And so there are two groups, that I know of so far in, so I live in San Francisco, so it's in the Bay Area. And they call their one is the Chileno Valley Newt Brigade.
Okay.
And then the other one is the Lexington Reservoir Newt Patrol.
All right.
And like, and so people walking on the road were noticing that newts were being run over during the newt breeding season, because the newts, they're in their little upland burrows during the summer and the dry season, but when it starts raining, they come out,
Yeah.
and they move en masse to their breeding pools. And so oftentimes they're crossing the road in a very specific area. And so thousands of newts were being killed
Wow.
on these two different roads. And so they, it was both of these groups started with one individual noticing and being worried about it and wanting to do something about it and caring and wanting to do something about it, talking to the community members, finding they have these huge volunteer groups now that go out and help these newts. The newt brigade goes and they transport the newts and other whatever critters they find on the road across the road so that they don't get hit. The other one, the road is too windy, and it's also the newts come out at night, so
Mm.
it's too dangerous for them to go save the newts. But they've been counting the roadkill, and they've been pushing local agencies and local landowners there to do something about making it better for the newts there. And so there's a project going up right now to build an elevate or well to do a crossing for
Hmm.
the roads to improve newt connectivity. And one of the ideas is to do an elevated road segment
Yep.
so that newts can go under, but the cars can still go over. That's been really cool to see. And that's definitely something that was by the community for the community.
Yeah.
And it really, I like even just seeing their groups grow. It's really cool when other folks become interested and they're just like, what's that? And then they like, oh, I didn't even know newts were here. I come here all the time and I never knew. And like, how can I help? And so I think that's another way to, I guess that's another result of just being curious of what's
Yeah.
around you and getting connected. And so
Talking about citizen science too, I think, is such an exciting idea. I mean, there's a lot of apps out there, there's a lot of social media components that can be involved. But what I love hearing too is it's not just people getting together to complain about the problem, they're going out and doing the science. They're going out, they're
yeah,
counting, they're keeping track of things because that's what's necessary. And I think it's very difficult sometimes, particularly for those of us who grew up in an urban area, to appreciate how much life is around us because we don't look for it and we've been told it's not there. I'm sure in San Francisco, you probably get this with coyotes and foxes the way we do in our urban areas. Of people saying, "Oh, I'm seeing them all the time now. There must be more of them." And it's, no, we're just taking away more and more of the spaces they can live, and they're getting more and more comfortable uh, navigating through the spaces we're forcing them into. And I imagine that's going to be an element of this. The success of a program like this legislation we've been talking about, is that, all right, we're going to do more. Like you said earlier, there's a lot of evidence to base it on, but there is going to be a degree of try this, see what happens. If it doesn't work, why didn't it work? How do we now pivot and adapt? Rather than, well, it doesn't work, so we can't do it.
yeah,
It definitely seems kind of built into the legislation that way. Of if at first you don't succeed. Um,
yeah.
is that something that is very supported by Center for Biological Diversity, or is it something that just sort of naturally fell into place through this legislation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things where, as much as we just wish we knew everything already and could just implement it,
Hmm.
that's just not realistic.
Yeah.
And so some of it is we do the best we can with what we know. So, you that's why we want to use the best available science to drive what we're doing and to drive like the projects that we work on. And also there is science that is like studies are still being done, research is still happening so that like we learn more every day.
Mhm.
And I think like adaptive management is really key because, kind of like where we are now, we didn't know when we were building the roads and development how much it would affect mountain lions and coyotes and bobcats
Yeah.
and newts. Like we didn't know, but now we know. Right. And so that's why it's really important, particularly for the wildlife crossing projects, that they're monitored
Yeah.
so that we know, okay, this is what we did. This is how we designed it. This is why we designed it this way. This is why we put it in this place. Did it work?
Hmm.
Like, is it working? And I think like what's really great is wildlife cameras really are a game changer. They've
Yeah.
helped so much. not just with this, but just in general. Even they're not even wildlife cameras, but ring cameras have been like huge, right? And like we're able to see so much more of what's going around, and what lives amongst us. And even like, I just wanted to say something to what you said earlier, like, because there are more cameras on the landscape, we are seeing a lot of different animals, lots of mountain lions in people's backyards, and people are like, oh my gosh, there's so many mountain lions. But the truth of it is they could have been there this whole time, and they probably were, and we're just seeing them more now because we have more cameras on the landscape. So there's that. But I think like getting an idea of what we're investing in and whether or not it's working is really important, because if it's not working, then we do need to figure out how to make it better. And I think what's really cool is we've been seeing, for crossings that have been going up in California, there's one in Santa Clara County, and that is an underpass for mountain lions. And that went up, I don't think it's been a whole year yet, but sometime last year it went up, or it was constructed. And then in December or January or something, a puma was filmed crossing using the underpass. And so it's like, it's working. So it's also really gratifying and exciting when it does work. And to have the evidence that shows like, hey, what we're doing is working. And so I think, but again, to your point, being adaptive is really, really important, because we don't want to do something that actually turns out to not be effective.
Yeah.
We want to make sure what we're pushing for and what gets implemented is effective, because that's the whole goal.
Well, it seems like a really positive process at this point. It's very exciting to see how it's going to move forward. I think to wrap up, we've covered a lot very quickly, talking about sort of the ecosystem benefits and services. We've talked about how individuals in their yards can make a bit of a difference and in their communities. I think something maybe a great point to wrap up on, and you touched on this briefly already, but how this all plays into that One Health concept of, if the ecosystem is healthy, if the wildlife is healthy, we're healthy. And it's relatively a relatively new idea, I think, in a lot of these conversations. Is there a way that we as individuals can talk about that accessibly? And not everyone is going to be able to do that, or has the time or patience to do that. Are there ways we can talk about these types of issues? Again, being mindful of the significant impact this way of thinking has on planning and our future. Do you have suggestions on how we talk about it accessibly, how we reach out to people who maybe are on the fence or for whatever reason don't get it yet, to try and bring them into the fold and get involved in a newt monitoring project or renaturalizing an area or something like that?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think it's something that me and my team think about all the time, because we're always trying to find ways to broaden our audience and message with this message.
Yeah.
So I don't know that I have the answer.
Well, I don't know why we're still talking then. This whole time I've been leading up to this moment to get the answer. And I won't accept 42 as the answer either. So,
yeah. But I think, to me, one thing that I've been learning over time in all my experiences prior to working at the Center for Biological Diversity and then now working here, because prior to that I was in academia and I was working at government state agency and in consulting. So I kind of had a wide variety of things. And I think as I've landed here, one of the things for me that I'm learning more and more every day is just like, how do we get people to feel connected to nature, connected to their environment, connected to their surroundings, and curious about it? Because I think it makes a really big difference, and I see it whenever I see. So I'm a herpetologist at heart, and I like looking for salamanders and snakes and stuff, and when we find them, and maybe hikers are just walking past us, they're like, "What is that? Like, what are you doing?" and it's just like, oh, like, have you seen a yellow-eyed ensatina before? Like, the salamander lives under logs and underground and whatever. And, they're just like, wow, I didn't even know that existed.
Yeah.
And like, I walk here every day. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's lots of different ways to get people to feel more connected. I think storytelling can be really helpful. I think, I don't know if you're familiar with P22.
Yes, I am.
Have you heard of? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So Hollywood mountain lion, lived in Griffith Park for over 10 years. And I think like so many people really connected with him. They loved his story. He came from, the Simi Hills and Santa Monica Mountains area and, crossed two huge freeways to get to this little plot of land that's really small for mountain lions. Like, I don't remember the numbers, but it's like, I think it's 9 square miles or something. And usually they have 100 square mile. Sorry, I use miles.
Oh, no. We can do that math in our heads. Come on.
Yeah. Okay.
As I quickly pull out a calculator.
Yeah. Anyway, and he made a life there, but then he was alone his whole life. He never had any mating opportunities, and so I think a lot of people really connected with his story, and it's been really amazing to see like the community rally around him and get really excited about mountain lions in urban areas. And so I think storytelling can be really helpful. Finding not a mascot, but like a wildlife representative from your area.
A symbol.
Can be. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that it really elicits a sense of pride in the community. Like, the Newt Brigaders are very, very proud of their project, and they should be, you know?
It's incredible.
Yeah. And so I think there's something there. I don't know how to answer your question, but I think there's something in that I'd like to explore more and kind of get more people connected.
And I really love that we started talking about connectivity of ecosystem patches and are ending on the connectivity of people to nature. It makes my brain very, very happy to do that on a Friday afternoon.
Well, you facilitated that and made it happen, so.
I'll take all the credit for it. All the credit's mine. To learn more about the Center for Biological Diversity and their campaigns, visit biologicaldiversity.org. You can find links to Dr. Tiffany Yap's research, past papers, the California legislation, and more in the show notes for this episode in your podcast player app or at defenderradio.com. I'd like to thank Dr. Yap for joining us, and you for always being curious along with me. Remember to follow the Fur Bears on Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube, and review Defender Radio on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen. Until next time, I'm Michael Howie for Defender Radio and the Fur Bears, reminding you to stay informed and stay strong.